So first off, just a logistical issue. Next week, I have a conflict at this time. So normally the very last lecture, I have you watch some videos on the topic of ethics. And so this year I just moved it to next week. So it'll be kind of weird. Normally I was hoping to wrap up usability, but I don't think we'll be able to wrap it up completely today. But we'll do as much of it as we can. Next week, you can watch the lectures online. And then the week after you come back, we'll finish usability. I'll talk about the lectures that you saw, and then it will just proceed as normal. So it's on the Moodle, but anyways, I'll just note that. Your assignments should be back to you now, is that right? Yeah? Okay. And so I don't mark them myself, the TA marks them, and so if you have questions, you can ask him about them. You should have his email. If not, I'll put it on the Moodle as well. And assignment 2, I'll maybe release before next week, but you're going to see some of what you need to do, and then we'll do more of it the week after. So I adjusted the deadlines a bit, so it will be due a bit later. So basically let's see how far we get today, and then I can always give you the assignment early, but you might not fully understand it until we do one of the lectures that's on something relevant to it. Okay, yeah.
I realized you didn't post the last class.
I didn't post the last class on Moodle, you mean?
Yeah.
It's possible. So it seems to end a week early.
Okay.
No, I'm just asking. The problem is there's no lecture assigned for the very last week of class.
No. I mean for last.
Oh, yeah, sorry. Thank you. Yeah, I know what you're saying. Yeah. So apologies. So last class, the video screwed up. So the audio did record. So I put the audio on Moodle, and the video, like the first, I don't know, it was weird. The first 5 minutes worked, and then it froze, and then it was just like that all the way through. So, but anyways, with the PDF and the audio, you should be able to follow kind of what happened. But yeah. So there is no screen recording, unfortunately, of last week. The other thing you can do if you really need that, you can also watch the relevant part from last year's course. So there's video recording of that too. Yeah. So I should note that I record these videos as a luxury to you. So they're not like, I'm not required to record them. So if something goes wrong, you're still responsible. I'm saying this to everyone in the room, but it's more relevant to the people that are listening to this after the fact that aren't in the room. But yeah, so anyways, I do my best with the recordings, but if something ever happened and the recording got lost, students would still be responsible for the material. But you always have the lectures from last year, and they don't change that much from year to year. And I've had a few weird issues that have happened, but I've never like completely lost everything, like where there's no record. I usually can recover at least the audio or something. Or one year, like a student was recording it, and so I got the audio from them. And yeah, anyways, whatever. So I do the best with the videos. 95% of the time it works, but there can be glitches here and there. Last week being one. So, and I don't know what went wrong. I noticed it was like super laggy on my computer, so I think it was some problem with my computer. But if I notice it getting laggy today, I'll maybe reboot the computer and just make sure that the video is okay. Other questions about anything? Okay. All right, so let me just recap what we talked about last class very quickly, and then we'll move on to the next topic. Yeah. So there will be no class next week, and I will see how far we get in this lecture. And then I might release it in the midterm, and then when I see you in 2 weeks from now, we'll definitely discuss it. Yeah, and I'll try and give you 2 weeks from 2 weeks from now. I have to look at the schedule. You'll have at least a week anyways. But yeah, I'll talk a bit about what you do in the assignment anyways as we go through. I do an example in class as well, so that's helpful. And so we won't get to the example today. But even if you get the concept today, you have a couple weeks to think about it, do the project, and then we do the example. Even if you started the assignment, like that time frame could work. So anyways, yeah. So what you'll do on assignment 2 is called a cognitive walkthrough. You'll see it today. Okay. Other issues, questions? Okay. Okay, so social engineering. Here's just some high-level principles, or just like the main points to remember. So it exploits the weakest point, the weakest link. Sorry, that's what we normally call it. So if you think of a chain, right, you have a bunch of links in the chain. Whichever, if one of the link is the weakest, then the whole chain is going to stop. Okay, so security is kind of the same way. You have maybe 100 ways of attacking a system. You only need one to work. Doesn't matter. Okay, and so if the way that works is through a human, then social engineering is your best shot. And what we've seen historically over the last decade or two is that going through a social engineering attack usually is the weakest link, or it has been for some time. Now, it's getting better, but anyways. It's hard to protect against because it's hard to define. It's not like you can mathematically model it or something like that. It's about procedures and that type of thing. And we will talk later about policies and procedures. So that's another topic in the course. So this is one way of addressing it. And we'll do a couple lectures on policies and procedures later. So what do people do, given that it's hard to protect against? So a lot of companies will focus on education and training, including Concordia. They this year, for the first time, they made us do like a training module on like phishing. It was specifically on phishing, but you can try to change your access control policy. So like who's authorized to do something, and so you can try and basically require more people to do things. And so there's trade-offs here with efficiency, but you can try and distribute permissions or capabilities. To multiple people, so that multiple people have to fail rather than a single person. You could hire a security firm to come in and try and breach. So to penetration testing or pen testing. And it also forces you to consider your reliance on some technical things. So anything that you know, well, here's some examples. So for example, we saw DNS. It showed up in a bunch of the attacks, right? We also saw it with certificate authorities and things like that. So DNS is important because it's a company that controls your DNS registrar. And if you can social engineer the company like GoDaddy, then you can sort of take over. SIM swapping is kind of similar. So if you can call up a telecom and convince them to, to authorize a different SIM card, the adversary's SIM card on your account, then they basically take control. They hijack your phone, essentially. And if I can hijack your DNS, then I can hijack your email and your website, your ability to get certificates. And so a lot of things, like at the end of the day, they just come down to DNS working right. So if DNS isn't working right, then they don't work either. And anything that's phone-based, same with your SIM. And then anything that's password-based, so that could be email accounts, that type of thing. You can think about customer support. That's another common theme that shows up. Right. So anyway, these are things that you would have to go through the policies and procedures about. and try and ensure that at least you're doing things as well as you can. Okay. Okay, now clean break. So that's social engineering. We'll talk about another topic that's kind of related to social engineering because it also involves the human aspect, but it's not from an adversarial perspective. It's more just from users trying to use your software. So you'll recall that when we did the evaluation framework with the password alternatives, we had deployability, security, and then usability was the third criteria. So usability is important to security. It's not directly about security. It's not a security thing directly, but it can impact security. So if you have a tool that's meant to provide security, but it has poor usability, then either people will use it wrong, and so it won't give you the security that you're looking for, or people won't use it at all, right? Or they'll try and circumvent it. So all of these things can lead to bad security outcomes, even if it's not directly about security, okay? So usability needs to be a consideration when you're thinking about security because poor usability can lead to poor security sort of indirectly. So as motivation, consider like a security tool will be vague. So a lot of what I say, typically you think of software. So a lot of usability is designed or is targeted at software, but it doesn't have to be software. It could be, could you understand a procedure or a policy? It could be a piece of hardware. Can you use hardware? Hardware is like a little more direct, but the methodologies that we'll see in this section, some of them are like very much geared towards software. So software will be kind of like the running example that we use, but to some extent you could apply these methodologies to things that aren't software specifically. So you have a security tool that you could think of as a software tool, and let's say that it's secure or it increases user security. But it has poor usability. Okay, so the traditional thinking was, sure, like we all know that there's software tools like that, but who cares? I mean, it's better than nothing, right? If you have some security tool and it's not usable, well, it's better than not having a security tool at all, okay? Then what happened is people started questioning that reasoning, saying, well, could it actually make you worse off than not having the tool at all, right? So for example, if users use it wrong, that outcome could be worse than them just not using anything in the first place, okay? And so that caused people to, I mean, there's a debate over whether this is just useless or if it's actually dangerous. But in either case, what we want is if we're going to go around proposing security tools, we want to make sure that they're usable as well so that they get used and they get used correctly, okay? So what goes wrong in this case is users can use it incorrectly. Which can lead to frequent errors. Users might avoid using it. And then if they're not using it, they're probably doing something less secure or not secure. Another principle is that users aren't thinking about security. I mean, let's say you work in a company, you have some security tools. nobody's there to be secure. That's not your job, really. You're there to do your job, right? And if you have to use some security tools in order to do your job, then that's fine. You'll use them. But security is not your end goal. It's a secondary goal for you. So you want to do, your first primary goal is to do your job, right? And then your secondary goal is, well, if I can do my job in a secure way, then I'll do it in a secure way as opposed to an insecure way. But security is always secondary. And so this will just sort of influence our methodology for how we think about usable security. So the primary goal, I should say, of users is to accomplish some task. Another problem with security and usability is something that we saw. Maybe came up in SSL. So we saw that SSL sometimes, if things go wrong, if the right things go wrong, you can be displayed a warning or an error. Okay, and then the user is required to take some action in response to it. So there's two problems with that, or there's at least two. One is that they just don't understand the error or the warning, so they don't know what they're going to do. Okay. The other thing is that maybe they understand it perfectly, but your software is generating so many errors so often, or it's requiring so many actions from the users that users they get fatigued and they care a lot the first couple times, and then eventually they just want it to go away, and so they sort of swat the window away by closing it or allowing always or that type of thing. So we call that habituation. So users will habituate to warnings and errors. And so this makes it harder to basically design security software because you can't be asking the user all the time what they want to do, or they'll get fatigued. So to that point, if you're not going to ask the user, then you have to decide for the user. But sometimes you're not sure. Like software can't decide, like, is an expired certificate okay that's been expired one day? I don't know. So we could ask the user, or the software can decide. Or you could try and do both. You could say, okay, the software is going to decide, but the user can always override it if they want. Okay? So that's called a default. So defaults are also very important in usable security, because if you can get your default behavior like correct for users, where it strikes the right balance between security and usability, then you don't have to bother the user so much with configuration or asking them for input and things like that. So paying attention to what the default is another aspect to trying to figure out whether your software is usable or not. So most users aren't going to change what the default is. The best illustration I've heard of this isn't from security. It's just something that's in a field called behavioral economics. But there were some economists, and they were looking at organ donation in the United States. And so this is if you were in a car accident, for example. Unfortunately, you died, but your organs could still be harvested and given to someone else who needed them. And so this is an option in most US states. Okay, so you can choose whether to be an organ donor or not. And what they did, the economists did, is they looked at two states, and they were like neighboring states, very similar in terms of demographic. In one state, like 95% of people were organ donors, and in the other state, like 5% were, right? And so they were like, well, what's the difference? There's not much difference between them on paper, and the difference was the default, right? So in the one state, you were an organ donor if you didn't say anything, but if you wanted to opt out of it, then you had to fill out an extra form. Okay? In the other state, it was the opposite. If you didn't say anything, you get your driver's license, you just submit your paperwork. then by default you will not be an organ donor. But if you fill out some special form or something like that, then you can opt into becoming it. Okay, so most people just did whatever the default was. Okay, they didn't want to bother with the extra paperwork, and so that generated this huge difference, right? And there was a big movement in government maybe 10, 20 years ago called the nudge movement, where governments started to rethink their defaults because they understood they could change people's behavior by just changing defaults without restricting their freedom. They still had the freedom to choose. You just choose what the default is. And then that can affect change even if you're not taking away people's choices. So anyway, software is much the same. And so defaults are important also because security works best when it's sort of in the background. Or it's best in terms of usability when, I mean, it's the most usable when you don't even need the user to do anything, right? When it's automated. You turn your computer on, some tool starts running. It's literally in the background of your operating system or whatever. You never even know it's there except for there's an icon on your screen, and that's it. So that's sort of the ideal case, but you can't always get there depending on what you want to do. Another principle is that software should guide the user. So when I was a kid, you would buy software physically, right? So you would go to this computer store and you wanted whatever, Microsoft Word, and you would get it and it would come in a box. You know, it would have the disk, the CD-ROM with the software on it, and you install it. And it also came with a manual, right? Like a book, right? And like a 200-page book. And this explained how the software worked, right? And the software developers, they assumed that people read the manual. Okay, that was the intention of the manual, right? And if you didn't read the manual and you had a question, you would at least try and find the answer in the manual first, you know, before you call technical support or whatever. And so, so you'd read the manual. Now, developers have a much more realistic understanding that users don't want to read manuals. There aren't even, you know, paper manuals anymore. But, you know, a lot of websites, you know, software will have like a website with documentation and that type of thing. But most of them realize that users just sort of figure it out by just using it, right? You click on buttons, you sort of hover your mouse over it to see what the buttons are called. You go through the menus. Maybe you look in the help, you know, section if you really can't figure something out, or you Google it and try and figure the answer. But the principle now is that the software should sort of guide you. It should be easy to use. You know what you want to do. You should be able to figure it out just from the interface itself. You shouldn't have to go reading secondary sources for it. Now, it also depends on how technical the software is and things like that. Like some special software for, like, I don't know, video editing or something like that, it might be like way more technical and you really need to have some documentation or take a course or something to understand it. But at least for user-facing, like average normal user-facing software, it should guide you. and we'll say and provide feedback. So I'll show you an example of a security tool that does this well. It didn't always do it well, but now it does. And then the other principle that you should remember is that your developers aren't users. So you can ask your developers, oh, is this usable? And they'll think it's usable, right? Because in their minds, they know how it works. They have a complete mental model of it. And so everything's easy, you know, to the person who developed it. But you don't really know until you give it to another user whether it's actually usable or not. Okay, so let's say you have some security tool and you're very happy with the security of it. Okay, you feel like, okay, this is a tool and it really does add security to it. And you want to figure out whether it's usable, whether the usability will be a problem with your software. Okay, what are some methodologies that you can use to test the usability of it? And so what I want to talk about are three methodologies that you can use.
as like some updates, like later versions. So in that scenario as well, there might be impact on the usability to the current version to the previous version.
Right.
So that will be in a scenario as well.
Yep, yeah. So updates could throw the user off for sure if they're comfortable using its current version and then you go and change things. So usability would be something that you should revisit. If you're not making a lot of changes to the user interface, maybe it doesn't matter. So it depends on what the update is. And then the update process itself could be subject to usability because in security, you often need people to keep things up to date, right?
Or updating.
Yeah, upgrading like all the time, right? And so you want like for example, you might have software that just automatically updates silently in the background, or at least that's the default, right? So that would be more usable than a piece of software that never warns you that there's an update available, and it would take you going to like file like update software to do it. Yeah.
Automatic pop-ups.
Or yeah, that too. So that would be kind of in the middle. So the middle would be like guiding the user, right? So a default would be like automatically update, but you could override it if you're an expert. You could guide the user, hey, there's an update available, you should install it. Do you want to install it, yes or no, right? But then let's say you're updating it every week. That's where you might get into like fatigue, right? Where the user is like tired of updating their software, and especially if it takes a minute and they want to use it right away. Yeah. And then the worst would be like they don't even know that they have to update it. Cool. Okay. So methodologies, there's 3 that we'll talk about at a high level and 1 that you'll do. So assignment 2, you're going to do one of these methodologies. Okay. So the methodology you'll do at a high level is called an expert review, and you'll use a specific kind of expert review called a cognitive walkthrough. Okay, you can do what's called a user study, and you can do what's called a field test or a field study.
For assignment 2, we don't need to do attack tree?
No attack tree. Okay, so an expert review is basically somebody's going to sit down and they're going to go through the software and try and figure out whether it's usable or not. Okay, and so this isn't the best because they might miss stuff, and they generally aren't going to be like a true user of the software. So we'll talk about like a method that you can follow that will at least make it better than just your developer saying, I think I understand how this works. But anyway, so basically you have one expert, or it could be more like 2 or 3, but like some small number of experts that review. And the expert is what we call a dual expert. So we'll come back to this later, which means that they know about usability themselves. So they're a specialist in usability, and then they also know about the tool itself. I'll call it domain knowledge, meaning they know about the tool itself. So they know how it should work. Okay. The second is user study. So a user study would be you just pull people in off the street, and you sit them down in front of your software, and you pay them a bit, and you get them to use it, and you measure or ask them questionnaires or things like that. So we'll go through the details. But you basically get it with your general population. And this would look like somewhere maybe 20 to 200 people. Depends on how big of a user study you did. And then the final is a field study. And so a field study means that you actually put your software inside your organization. So you want to deploy it. It's kind of like a slow rollout where you sort of test it. So you might take half of your company and give half of them the tool, and the other half not. Or if it's an update, you might update half of them and then keep the other half on the current tool. And then you're going to just let them try it for a couple months. And you might collect feedback automatically, like the thing. It might have tools that automatically report like statistics and things like that, or you might ask questionnaires and things like that. Okay. The thing about the field study is that you're giving it to the actual users. Okay, so you're giving it to the actual people that are using the tools day to day. Okay, So we'll go through these one by one. I'm going to do it out of order, so I'll start with the user study first, and then we'll talk about these other two. The user study is kind of the sweet spot, I would say, between them. Field studies are the best. They'll give you the best results, but they're the hardest to do. Expert reviews are very easy to do. You can do it at a drop of a hat, but it doesn't give you the best usability results. And a user study is kind of a good balance where it's kind of hard to do, but it's feasible, and it tends to give good results. But we'll see the pros and cons of them as we go through. Yeah, okay, that's all I'll say for now. We'll talk about more. Okay. So we'll list out the pros and cons, and then I'll talk a bit about the methodology, like how you actually do it. Okay, so the pros are that you're testing with normal people. You're not having your developers try and figure it out, or experts. Now, the flip side is that your normal people aren't necessarily the actual users of your software. Like maybe your software is designed for professionals, right? Or people with a certain background. And then if you pull people off the street, they don't have that background, and so they're not your target audience anyway. Okay, so you have to think about it. We call that representativeness. So how representative is your sample of people versus what you want? So how close are the participants to your actual users? So maybe it's like a social media or something like that. That's aimed at everybody, right? So then the people that you come in will be representative. But then you might look at demographics like age, educational background, things like that. And then you might decide, oh, I'm doing this at a university, so I'm getting a lot of students, right? And so students tend to be younger than the general population. They're all in engineering, so they all have an undergraduate in something technical, so they have better technical expertise than your typical random person. And so then that's going to skew the results, okay? And so that you would say, well, that's bad in terms of representativeness. So knowledge, experience. Another thing is what we call ecological validity. So let's say you do a lab study. We'll go through the methodology, but basically you're going to pull someone in, usually in a one-on-one environment. You might sit them down with a laptop, and somebody's telling them what to do, right? So you have the person who's administering the user study. They're sitting there with a clipboard, and they're watching every little thing that you do, right? So you're the user, you're sitting there. You're going to be extra careful. You're going to be extra diligent. You know you're getting paid for it. You know somebody's watching you. The way that you use the software could be completely different than if you were at home and no one was supervising you, okay? So we might say that it has poor validity because it's the way that people are behaving in the laboratory setting is different than the way they would behave in the real world, okay? So that's the ecology of where they are has a role. So we call that ecological validity. So lab environment causes different behavior. Another con is you can only do kind of like a narrow set of tasks. So normally it's typical that a session might be somewhere between 30 minutes and 60 minutes. Now you could maybe bring users back for more than one session, but most user studies, it's just one session, one user, one session. A session's about half an hour to 60 minutes, okay? And because you're explaining, they're using it for the very first time, and you're explaining what you want them to do and things like that, and they're being really careful and going slowly, you can't ask them to do a lot with the software, okay? So you can only test really narrow things, okay? So your coverage is small, so you have a small coverage. And it can also skew your results as well in kind of a weird way. So the story I always give, this also has nothing to do with security, but a good example of this is, okay, so there's a soft drink, Coke and Pepsi, right? Everyone knows Coke and Pepsi. So back in the 90s, I want to say, what Pepsi decided to do is they were rivals with Coke. So they came up with this new marketing campaign, and they thought it was really great. So they would go into grocery stores, and they would do a blind taste test. So they would sit there at a table. They would give you a sample of Coke, a sample of Pepsi, but you didn't know which one was which, and then you would drink them both. And the thing about Pepsi as opposed to Coke is that Pepsi is very sweet compared to Coke, okay? And so what happened is that users, when they take a small sip of pop, they prefer the sweet one, okay? And so anyway, so people would do it, and then they would go and buy Pepsi instead of Coke. And so it was very successful. And so Coke was getting stressed out because they were losing a lot of their market share to Pepsi because of this Pepsi challenge. So then Coke said, okay, you know what? We're going to beat Pepsi at their own game. So they went back to the science lab, and they started working on a new formula for Coca-Cola. Okay, so they came out with a new formula. It was called New Coke. It was just branded as Coke as opposed to Coca-Cola. And they actually replaced, so you couldn't get the original Coca-Cola anymore. You could just get Coke, which was and people now call it New Coke. But anyways, okay, so then they did the exact same thing that Pepsi did. They set up booths in grocery stores, and they gave people New Coke, and they gave them Pepsi, and people liked New Coke better. It was even sweeter than Pepsi. It was kind of citrusy, and it tasted pretty good, okay? So then they would start buying New Coke. Now, the problem is that people liked it when it was a taste test in the grocery store. Then they would buy a case of it, take it home, and then they would drink an entire can of New Coke. And all of a sudden, it didn't taste so good, right? All those things like the sweetness and the citrusy flavor, it's good in a small amount, right? But when you drink an entire Coke, like a can of it or a couple cans of it, it gets kind of like syrupy and goopy tasting, and people didn't like it, okay? And so anyway, so the bringing it back to usability, if you ask users to do a small task, they may like it because it's kind of like taking a sip of something, right? But if you make them do it, if you make them drink an entire can of it, right, they might have a completely different response. So an example of this from software that's also not security, but it's at least software, is going back to Microsoft Word. It was pretty hard to use. It was pretty complicated software. And there was also a lot of advanced features that you could do with Word that your average user had no idea that they existed. Nobody was reading the manual. And so what Microsoft decided is, we're going to put this cartoon character into Microsoft Word called Clippy. Does anyone remember that? Yeah? Okay. Anyways, it was like this little dancing paper clip. And when you opened a new document, it would be in the bottom corner, and it would like have a cartoon pop up, and it would be like, hey, can I show you how to do macros? Or, you know, it looks like you're trying to do this. Can you do this other thing, right? And so I don't know the full story behind it, but I'm absolutely certain that they user tested it. And probably people liked it for the first day, right? They're like, oh, this is actually useful. I'm learning new things, right? The problem is, you know, when you've been using it for 3 months and you know what you're doing, and this thing's like dancing around, and they didn't make it easy to like get rid of it either, right? Then your experience is completely different, right? So that's like drinking like a whole case of the new Coke, right? Like, so anyway, so when you ask users to do a narrow set of tasks, you don't get good coverage of all the usability, but the second thing is that you can get a skewed response because they're just sort of sipping your software, and things that are usable at first but would be irritating or fatigue you in the long run, you're not going to pick up on those types of things, okay? So it won't catch, I'll call it long-term fatigue. Okay, and then the final bit is like it's kind of expensive. And slow. You have to like figure out your whole study. You have to write down the questions. You have to bring people in. So let's say you do 200 people at 60 minutes. Well, that's 200 hours, right? So someone has to administer this test, for 200 hours. And then there's all the prep work and all of that type of stuff. And then at the end of the day, you just get what a user could do in 30 minutes or 60 minutes at the very end. Okay, so it's expensive, but it's probably not as expensive as a field study. So these are sort of, this is kind of like the cheapest. This is moderately expensive, and then this could be more expensive. It could be less. It depends on the specifics. But anyways, I'll say time consuming maybe instead of slow. So it takes a lot of time. Okay, so how do you actually do a user study? So I won't go through every last detail, but I can at least bend your ear for 15 minutes or 20 minutes about it, and you'll learn a little more than you would know if you've never looked at this before. Okay, so the first thing you should do before you do anything on the user study, and it also depends on where you are, but I mean you should do it anyways, but especially if you do it in a university environment, is you need to get ethics clearance. Okay, so you're dealing with real human users. Getting them to use security tools isn't going to cause like long-term psychological damage to them, probably, right? Unless if it was really bad, your software, but you still need to go through that clearance process. So it's usually pretty easy to get clearance, but sometimes the things that you're asking to do could actually damage your users, right? So like, for example, next week when you watch the lectures on ethics, some of them concern like tests that you might do with networking, right? So let's say I want to test what websites are censored in different countries, right? So I give people software, they install it on their phone, and it has a million websites built into it. It just pings all of them and then just says, yes, I could access that. No, I couldn't access that, right? But imagine you're the government and you're controlling your internet, right? And you're looking at this phone and it's going to certain websites, right? You don't know that this is a user that's in a user study, right? You just see that, oh, this IP address is accessing this website or trying to, if it's a censored website, right? So you could actually get that user in trouble politically in their country. So that's the kind of thing that you have to consider. So ethics isn't always, in fact, what the lecturers will argue is that there's an ethical dilemma, basically an ethical dimension to almost all research you do, even if it's like boring crypto math. There's always some application of that to the real world, and you have to think about whether that's a good application or a bad application. But anyways, for user studies, you need to get ethics clearance. So if you want to do, say you love this lecture so much and you said, for my 6150 final project, I'm going to do a user study. That would be a great project, right? As long as it had to do with security, like of a security tool or something like that. But you're not going to do it in time, okay? Because you're going to have to get ethics clearance, and at a university, it takes months in order to get it. Okay, so this applies to basically any study with human participants. And if you don't have humans, it's arguably not usability. So it might concern, so it's going to concern the activities of the study. Sometimes use deception. So especially with security, you don't want the users to come into your study knowing it's a study about security, because then because of ecological validity, they're going to behave more secure than they normally would, right? So let's say you're doing some user study and you just want to see what passwords users pick. You could say, hey, we're doing a user study on passwords, so go to this website and set a password. Now they're thinking, oh, this is a user study about passwords, I better pick a good one, right? Whereas if you tell them, oh, this is a user study about this website, and then in the process of using the website, you get them to set up a password, the study's really about the password, but the user doesn't know it, right? So in that case, you're using deception. And it's okay to use deception in user studies, but there's just rules about, like, you have to disclose the deception to the user at the end of the study and things like that. So these are the issues that would an ethics board would clear out. So I didn't really explain the process. I'll do it in the next slide. Or in the next point, sorry. So activities of the study, so like you're doing the network traffic analysis, that type of thing. It's going to be specific to the study. Deception is another one that you have to pay attention to. And then if you collect any personal data, which you usually always do, even if it's for demographic information, or going back to the password one, you can't ask a user for their real password. Okay, you couldn't take that off of them in a user study, because then the research associate could turn around and log into their websites or something like that, okay? Or let's say I had like my computer and it was recording every keystroke because that was somehow important to the user study. I couldn't make them go to Facebook and log in, because then I would inadvertently get their password, right? So how you handle personal data, who has access to it, what do you do when the user study's over, how do you delete it, how long do you retain it for, all of those types of things you have to plan out, okay? So ethics clearance basically is just, it's like a written plan where you basically say, this is the study I want to do, these are the questions I'm going to ask, this is the data I'm going to collect, this is how long I'm going to retain it. All of these details you just put in, and then it goes to a committee. So there's, at Concordia, I don't know how many people sit on the committee, let's call it 20 people, and they'll read through your report, and then they'll either say, change it, they might deny it outright, but it's more likely that they would say, okay, we don't know enough about this, we need more information about this, or you need to modify this, or it's accepted. Okay, so it could come back for modifications or acceptance. Now, ethics boards get things wrong. There are sometimes academic studies are done, a university signs off on it, then the authors go and they try and publish the paper, and then the academic community freaks out about the paper and says that wasn't ethical, you shouldn't have been able to do that, and they say, well, it doesn't matter, my university approved it. And so anyway, so just because you get the check mark, sometimes they don't understand what they're signing off on, and so ethics is sort of necessary but not sufficient condition for doing research that's actually ethical, getting the rubber stamp. Now, if you're in a private organization, let's say you're Facebook, and you want to test whether, you can influence people's moods by showing them very depressing news only, which was an experiment that Facebook did that was everyone thought was bad and they should not have done. You don't have an ethics board, right? And so in that case, you need to think about it yourself as the person that's about to do the study. Some big companies, maybe they would like try and model this by having an ethics clearance, but anyways. So this is sort of a university specific thing, but ethics is not university specific, but clearance of ethics is. Okay, so whatever, we've got our ethics clearance, it's in hand, we like it. Now we want to get users to actually participate in our study, so we need to recruit them. Okay, so you're going to advertise your user study somehow. right? You may even walk around Concordia and see like there's bulletin boards and things like that with advertisements for user studies. And if you don't pay attention as you walk around, but anyways, okay, so you might advertise it. But where you advertise it is going to have a big influence on who you get, okay? So you remember you want ecological validity. So you want your target user of your tool to match the people that are coming into your study, okay? So if you don't want university educated, people of like that are younger than 30, right? Then going onto a university campus and putting advertisements everywhere, that's probably not a good approach, right? If you do want, if that is your demographic, then going to the grocery store and putting it up might not be the best approach, okay? So where you advertise will influence who responds. Many universities will maintain a list. So there's people that have done studies in the past, and every now and then they get people that are sort of unique in terms of their demographics, and so they just keep asking the same people to come back. And another option you can do is just do it online. So it depends on what your study is, but if it's software and people can go and download it and do it on their own computer, and they don't have to be in the same room as you, then you can just do it online. Maybe you could Zoom with them, or it could just be sort of completely automated. And if you do it online, then there's a bunch of services that let you, I don't know how many of these are still around, but they're websites where you can pay people to do small tasks, like small amounts of money. Okay, so they're not all user studies, but over time it's basically become just about user studies because there's not a market for anything else really. But like if you want someone to go in and clean up your music library or something like that, you might pay them, I don't know, 5 cents a song or something like that. So that was the original idea of these websites, but now it's almost always used by user studies. And so you can pay people whatever, $5, $10, $20 to take a survey. Maybe download your software and take a survey or use a website or something like that, and you can get results this way. And because they're used so much, especially Mechanical Turk, researchers have done detailed studies of who's the average user of these websites and what are their demographics. And so their demographics might not match what you want, but you at least know what they are. They're not just random internet people and I have no idea who they are, okay? So you can get like pretty detailed studies of what the demographics are, and then if they look like a good match to your user study, then this could be the easiest way of doing it. Okay. All right. So now you recruit a bunch of users. Let's say you want to do, I don't know, a smallish user study, maybe 50 people. Usually what you'll do is you'll recruit more than 50 people. Okay. So you'll get interest from maybe 100 people, and you'll give them a pre-study questionnaire to screen them. Okay, so what you can do is in the questionnaire, you'll ask about demographics. Demographics means like, age, gender, background, expertise, like whatever it is. But knowledge and expertise is the main one that's going to skew your results. Everything else, like maybe will or won't. It depends a lot on the application itself. But so you will have their demographics, and then you want to match it to what you want for your user study. So to your target user. So if you're getting too many people that look a certain way, then you might drop them from the study and take other people. Okay, yeah, so you'll use this to screen participants. So if you so if you have too many experts in your group, you'll drop them, you'll stop, and then you'll try and recruit people that aren't experts or vice versa. And another thing you can do, so it's best to just get a representative sample to begin with. That's the easiest thing that you can do. But sometimes you just can't. Like you don't have people in the right demographics or not enough of everyone, and not everything is like perfectly balanced, and you're trying to recruit more and more people, but you just can't find people that are willing to do it. You can do statistical weighting, okay? So you can say, oh, this person has a lot of expertise, and half my users have the same amount of expertise as this one person, but in my sample of 100 people, they're like basically the only one that has that level of expertise. So I'm going to treat their results as if they were 50 people instead of one person. Now that's a very extreme example and probably not very reliable, but you can tweak, you can use statistics to some extent to try and balance out your group, as long as you're transparent about what you're doing and why. So any imbalances in your group can be compensated by doing some statistical weight. Not any, but it's possible. Okay, another thing that you probably do here, but it depends. Actually, I don't know, it's maybe more traditional that you do it after. So the questionnaire you basically get for free, but at a certain point you need to pay the user. And it's really important that you pay them before the actual study itself, or like when they come into the study. You can pay them at the end. It's not the timing of it, but the important thing is that the participation in the study has no bearing on the payment. Okay, so they're getting paid either way. All right. And if they want to leave the study halfway through, then that's fine. Then they still get paid. Okay. If you make payment contingent on the completion of it, then you might have people that want to exit early and they won't, and they might be thinking, oh, I only have to say good things because I want to get paid, or that type of thing. So it could bias your results as well. Okay. So you're going to pay the user. It's not going to be contingent on completing the study. You don't want bad data. So if a user wants to walk out in the middle of it, it's better to just let them go and let that data point go. As opposed to trying to entice them to stick around just for a payment, just for money. You also don't have to explicitly pay users. So different studies do it different ways. This can add up, depending on what your budget is. Like say you're working on a university budget, you want to do, let's say it's more like an online questionnaire or something like. In fact, actually, as students, you probably get questionnaires about things from time to time, and people want to entice you to do it. But even if they paid you $20 to do a survey, if 1,000 students show up, that's $20,000, right? And that's way beyond the budget of any like departmental thing where they just want your feedback. Because they want to make your experience better or something like that. They don't want to pay $20,000. So they might do things like raffles. So they might be like, okay, do the survey, and then we'll put your name in a draw, and we'll have like 2 iPads. They're $500 each, so it's still $1,000. But you have a 1 in 200 chance of winning a $500 thing, as opposed to giving you $5 or whatever. So there's ways around it. Like if you want to do a user study yourself, you're just a grad student. You might not have the budget to pay all of your users, and so you can do things like that. So it's kind of like a probabilistic payment. Okay, so we did a lot of legwork before. We haven't even started the study itself. Okay, so we went and we got ethical clearance. That took 3 months. Then we spent a month advertising it and waiting for people to come in. And as they were coming in, we did the questionnaire, and then we had to go through the data and try and select the users that we actually want to bring them in. And so now, it's been 4 or 5 months, and now we're ready to do the actual study. We have to design the study itself and figure out what we're actually testing and that type of thing. So these things take time. Okay, so we're ready to do the actual study. So you obviously have one shot at doing, that's not true. You can do a study more than once, right? If it goes wrong the first time, you can redo it, but that's another 5 months and another $2,000, right? And so people don't want to do it more than once, right? So they're going to design the study carefully. Sometimes they'll do what's called a pilot study, where you run 3 people through your study, and then you go over everything, you double check it and make sure it's perfect before you start doing it. A lot of times if you design the study, you're not necessarily the person in the room with the clipboard measuring it, right? You might pay someone else to do that. And so once you authorize a study, you aren't really checking in on how it's going until the very end, right? So if there's a problem that came up, you don't realize it until it's the end, and now all your data is useless or something like that. So you might pilot a study first. So this would be like a small set of users. And often you might pilot a couple times, right? So you might pull in 5 users, do a mini study, pull in another 5, do a mini study, and tweak it. And then eventually you feel like your study's pretty good. It also, I should also mention it kind of depends on why you're doing the study. So there shouldn't be a difference, but there's actually a concrete difference between, I'm doing a study because I want to publish a paper on it. If I want to publish a paper on it, then everything has to be perfect, right? If I work at a company, I don't care about methodology, okay? Now, if I follow an academic methodology, it's good because it's going to try and eliminate a lot of biases, right? But I might be more tolerant, like I might change the study halfway through and do things like that. And if I'm at a company, I don't care. I'm not publishing the results, right? But as long as I have to know what I'm doing and why that might bias the results, then maybe I would get away with it, okay? But definitely, if you're doing it at an academic level, you have to be really careful about it. Okay, now there's different kinds of studies. So what do you actually do? So you come in, the user is going to use their software. Like what does that look like, right? So at the end of the day, you're trying to answer whether something's usable or not. And that's a pretty hard question to answer directly, and much easier question. So this doesn't apply to all user studies, but a much easier question to answer is it more usable than something else? Okay, so we have a comparative study. So there's actually 2 things, like maybe the current thing that everybody's using and then the thing that you want people to use, right? And you're actually comparing the 2 results, okay? So for comparative studies, there are special rules for them. So not every study is comparative, but a lot of them are. Okay. Now you might be tempted to say, okay, I have 2 systems. Like say I have my new password manager. Okay. So I'm going to come in, I'm going to get some users. I'm not going to tell them it's a password study, but I'm going to come in and ask them to register for my website, and I'm going to have them just do it with a traditional password first, and then I'm going to put them on a computer with a password manager, and then I'm going to get them to redo the same process with the password manager, okay? And then I'm going to try and measure some difference between them. Now, the problem with that approach is the first time you ask the user to do it, they're using the normal tool, and they're actually learning something by using it, right? By having them set up a password, they're thinking about passwords. Passwords are so ubiquitous, it's maybe not the best example, but let's say I had some other software that I asked you to do a sort of more complicated task. You didn't know how to do it with the software, but if I get you to use the old system first, you start to get a feel for how you do it with the software. Then I ask you to use my new system. You might be able to do it a little bit faster on the second system just because you did it, not because the second system is better, just because it's now your second time doing the same task as opposed to your first time, okay? So you have to be careful when you're doing these comparative studies that there's a learnability effect, where if you ask the user to use system A and then use system B, then they might learn something in the process of using system A and carry that into their evaluation of system B. Okay, so what we do that's the most common is we do a study design that's called between subjects, is the fancy name for it. And we don't have users use both systems. Okay, so if we want to test whether system A is more usable than system B, no user in our study will use both system A and system B. What we'll do is we'll split them randomly in half. Half of them are going to use system A and only system A, and half of them are going to use system B and only system B. Okay? Now it's a lot harder because nobody's used both systems. They themselves can't compare the two systems for you. Okay? So we have to use our measurements and our questionnaires and things like that to make that inference between the two systems. And I'll talk about that after the study itself. But okay, so we do a between subjects design. A random half use system A, and other half use system B. In specific cases of software, we sometimes call this A/B testing. It's a special case. So like Google will A/B test. They'll let you do it actually. So let's say you want AdWords, right? So you're going to pay for an advertisement on Google results. They'll say, hey, give us 2 phrasings of your ad. We'll run it for a bit, and when we get 1,000 people that have seen it, we'll tell you, 30% click through on wording A, and when you worded it in wording B, it went from 30% to 45%, right? And then what you can do is you can say, okay, wording B is better than wording A, so now I'm going to start with wording B, and then maybe I'll vary it a bit as well. And so you can sort of slowly like try and milk the most out of your wording or whatever. So that's called A/B testing. It's not that users were shown both and asked which one do you like better. It was just some of them were shown A, some of them were shown B, and I can measure how many people click on the ad in world A and in world B, and that's the measurement, the differences that I care about. And so this eliminates the bad thing that we don't want is learnability. Okay. Now this section kind of goes with 5. Like we haven't talked about like what are you actually doing in the user study, but you're generating some data, and I'm going to talk about how you analyze the data, but it's also going to like tell you what kind of data that you're doing in the actual study itself. So we'll call it post-study analysis. Okay, so during the study, you're going to collect data. and you're going to use the data to basically say something. I mean, at the end of the day, you want to say system B is more usable than system A, okay? So how do you formalize that? So first off, you start with something called a hypothesis. So your hypothesis could be, usually you do what's called a null hypothesis, which is like the default. And the default's kind of like the simplest version of the world. So in the simplest world, just system A is more usable than system B. System A being the thing that everyone's already using. So the null hypothesis is just that I didn't do anything. I designed this whole system and it's useless, okay? But I want to disprove that. So I'm going to try and use my data to disprove that statement itself, okay? So you formalize your hypothesis, or like what exactly it is that you're testing. And then you're going to try and prove or disprove the hypothesis. You're going to use statistics usually. Okay, so you're going to come to me and you're going to say, I put 200 users through a study and I wanted to well, let's say my hypothesis was that let me just flip around, just say, my hypothesis is that my system is more usable than the current default, okay? I put 200 users through it, here's the data. We haven't talked about what we're measuring, I'll talk about that in a sec. And the data shows statistically, right, that users feel that my system system B is more usable than system A, okay? Then what I might say is, okay, I see the data, I don't question the data is fine, but how do you know that wasn't just random chance, right? You took your users, you split them in A and B. What if you got all the experts in group B and none of your experts in group A, just by chance, right? So one thing I should go back and note is when you do it between subjects design and you do a random half, there are occasions where you might not use something that's truly random, okay? You might notice that demographically, like I only have 2 real experts in my set of 20 people, so I'm going to make sure that one of them ends up in group A and one of them ends up in group B, because I don't want them both in A or both in B. So sometimes you go in, it's related to the statistical weighting part, and you might like kind of distribute users not purely randomly. But if you have enough users, then random is the best. Okay, random is the least biased result. But there's a danger that you do your whole study and you don't get any significant results because you just didn't have enough users so that they were actually balanced groups or whatever. So if you have a really small set of users or some like weird characteristics, then you might go in and not distribute things randomly. But anyways. So what I'll say is, oh, I see your data, I see the statistic, I agree with that number that you wrote down, but I just think it's due to chance, okay? So what you want to do is you want to prove it so that it's more likely, not just slightly more likely, but like significantly more likely due to the actual test, to the actual data than just due to chance alone, okay? So you're trying to, the statement that you're trying to prove is that it's unlikely that the results are due to chance alone. So that's kind of what the statistics say. So there's usually some confusion around statistics and things like p-values and things like that. Okay. Okay, I'll do a few more of these and then we'll go for a break. So data usually is of 2 types. So what are you actually measuring in the actual study itself? You could have quantitative data, meaning numbers. So this could be like time, like you start a stopwatch, I ask you to do a task and then I stop it, right? So time to complete a task. Could be every time you make an error, I write it down and I count up the number of errors, something like that. Okay. So some things that we would attribute to usability could be quantified with numbers. Okay. Yeah, turnaround time. Sure. Yeah. So there's different types of data. Then, but is that all there is to usability? Can you always reduce usability down to a number? Okay. Not always. Like sometimes usability is more about like how you feel about it, right? Like when that clippy paperclip thing is in Microsoft Word, that's not a number. It's not slowing me down or anything like that. It's just annoying, right? I want to express in my user study that it's annoying, but I can't, and they could ask you how many times were you annoyed or something like that. But anyways, that's more of a qualitative thing. It's about my thoughts and my feelings. Okay. So you can also look at qualitative data. So most user studies also look at qualitative data. So like thoughts, feelings, that kind of thing. And yeah, a lot of usability falls into this category. Okay. Now, these are not numbers, obviously. And so the problem is, let's say you want to measure the usability of something, but it's basically based on qualitative stuff. Okay, there's no way to put a number on it. You're asking people about their thoughts and their feelings about using the software, but you want to do a statistical test, right? You want to prove statistically that your system is more usable, but all you have is a bunch of thoughts and feelings of users. Is there any way you can turn thoughts and feelings into numbers?
Depending on the number of users having similar pattern of thoughts.
Okay, so you could count.
Patterns and
Sure. So you can use an approach that's called coding, where you like write down what they said, and then you count the number of occurrences that everyone brings up a certain point across two groups. So that's one way of doing it. So that's an approach. There's a simpler way, though, that I'm fishing for. Okay, so yeah.
Sometimes YouTube asks me how I feel about the ad after I see it. So I feel it's more like a qualitative measure of how I feel about the ad.
Yeah. So if you can turn it into a binary, like like a plus, a thumbs up, or a thumbs down, then that could give you a number as well. So if you could reduce the qualitative data itself to something like a number, yeah. So that's a good approach as well. There's one other thing that's actually a generalization of what you said. Okay, so this is something that everybody in this room knows. Every one of you have been asked qualitative stuff before, and because the people wanted a number at the end, they made you do something.
rating.
Like
Okay.
feedback,
What's more
satisfied
specific?
They were satisfied with how they're gonna be good or bad and inappropriate.
Okay, good. So what you'll do is you'll open up a questionnaire, and there'll be like some statement, and you'll see something that looks like this.
Slightly feeling towards that.
Feeling.
There'll be like something like this, and it will say, I strongly agree, strongly disagree, neutral, don't know. Okay, so this whole thing is about turning qualitative statements into numbers, okay? So we call this a Lakert scale. So there's a name for it. And there's a few things, before you use one, there's a few things that you should think about. Okay, so I've done studies where it's just like pages and pages of this, right? What happens after you've read 30 statements and you've thought hard about them? What happens? You start to get tired, right, and fatigued. Okay, so you want to keep these things short. Okay, if I get really fed up with it, what do? So I could just quit, like just stop filling it out. But let's say, I don't know, my payment is contingent, which you should never do, but let's say in theory it's contingent on me finishing or something like that. I really want to finish it, but I'm lazy. So what do I do? So I could skip it. I could randomize my answers. I could don't know all the way down, or agree all the way down, right? Okay, why is that bad? Let's say your users, you have a 50 question questionnaire, and after 30, they just start saying, I don't know. Okay, so it's bad because the last 30 questions, sorry, the last 20, whatever, you have no data for, okay? Now, one thing that you could do that's very simple is every user is going to get fatigued, whether they exhibit that kind of behavior or not, okay? They will at least get fatigued. And the very first question you read, you're going to think a lot harder about than the very last question, okay? I guarantee that, even if you're as good-natured as you can be, okay? So one thing that you should do is you should randomize the order of the questions so that not everybody in the world has the same first question and everyone has the same last question. Then your data is really going to suffer. If you randomize it, then at least if users get fatigued and they don't answer so well, it blends across all the different questions, okay? So randomized order of questions. So I do that, but I still, I don't like the people who are like strongly agree. Is there anything else I can do to address that problem specifically?
Don't ask it frequently.
Sorry?
Don't ask it frequently.
Yeah, actually, my answer is almost the opposite. So you'll sometimes see this in surveys. You might not notice it, or you might not know it why, but now I'll tell it to you, and the next time you get one of these things, you'll notice it for sure. Sometimes they ask you the same question more than once, right? And you're like, I already answered that question. Why are they asking it to me again? Well, that's actually deliberate, right? They're trying to see whether you answer consistently, right? So if you said strongly agree when it was question 2, and now you're only agree when it's question 17, right? That shows some inconsistency. And then that tells me statistically that maybe you're not paying attention, okay? And then if I really want to be sure, what I can do is I can actually invert the question, right? So in question 2, I can ask you, do you think B is more usable than A? And you're like, strongly agree. Then if in question 17, I ask you the opposite question, do you think A is greater than B? Then you should say, I strongly disagree, because that would be consistent with your former answer. And if you're like, I agree all the way along, right, then you're going to have an inconsistency in your answers, okay? So yeah. So we do a consistency check by asking same question more than once, especially the key questions. More than once. And then sometimes we invert the question. As well. So we ask them both the question and the inverse of the question, and then try and see if they're consistent across them. Okay, so that's good. We're overdue for a break, so why don't we take 10 minutes. Okay, so we've done the analysis. Now I'm just going to go back to the actual study because we didn't say, but basically from this you can sort of get a sense of what you're doing in the study itself. So the study will look different depending on what you're measuring and how you're doing it and all of those things. So it's sort of vague on details, but basically you want to get them to use the software, let's call it. It might be an A/B test, so you get them to use one of the two. And then whatever you can measure quantitatively, you'll measure. So usually someone else is in the room, they're watching, they're taking notes. They might ask oral questions, that type of thing. It's something I didn't mention, I should actually mention here, is that normally the supervisor, the person administering the test, they also don't want to help the user, because if they help one user like in one set of the participants, but they're not providing the same level of help for the others, that can also skew the results. Okay, so the administrator of the test usually follows what we call a script. So when they come in, they say, hi, sit down, like this is what the study's about. They'll read, they're literally going to read it to you. They're not going to say it off the top of their head because then they might say it differently to different users, okay? So they're very careful about making every instance of the study as close to each other as possible, okay? Eliminating any variance between them. So they'll, everything that they say will be written out more or less. So they'll just read it. And then they'll have like kind of a diagram, like if the user asks for help here, then I should do this. Or if they ask for help here, then I'm allowed to do this, but I can't do this type of thing. So you try and you figure that all out in advance. So you can provide support to the user, but you have a plan for how you do it. And you don't want the administrator to take over the task and just do it for the user instead, because that will completely bias your results. Okay, so everything is kind of scripted. But anyways, other than that, they're just measuring. So if it's software, the software might measure it itself, right? Like when they click on a button, it starts a timer or whatever. Or it might be old-fashioned, like with a stopwatch, or like putting check marks down. You might ask them questions and they might write down your responses, and then you will have them fill out usually a survey to get the qualitative stuff like this. It can be an exit survey, so it's the same time and place as doing the study. It's just when they're leaving, you give them the study, or it can be it could be something that's after the study itself, like a follow-up kind of questionnaire. Okay, and then in terms of statistics, you have all your data now, so you'll do your statistical tests. I can't tell you what statistical tests to use. This area is like highly complicated, and it's actually not my expertise at all. So I'll just say it requires expertise. What you're shooting for is something called statistical significance. Which basically says the results you're seeing, like the difference between A and B, for example, that would be a result. So some measurable difference between them, even if it's based on a Likert scale question. That result, there is a difference between A and B. Okay, so it's not that they're the same. And that difference is unlikely to due to just chance itself. Okay, I can't say 100% certainty it's not due to chance. It can always be due to chance. But the probability that that's due to chance as opposed to being a real result is so low that you might as well neglect it. Okay. Now, usually you can't even say that it's so low that you can neglect it. Usually, there might be like a 5% probability. Okay. And a 5% probability is actually a pretty big probability, right? You run 20 studies and one of your 20 results, right, will be just due to chance alone, right? And so there's also there's a broader movement, not really in security usability because it's too new, but like with user studies in general, like in psychology and things like that, where there were very famous psychological tests that were done in the 70s and things like that, and people can't replicate them. They try and do them again, but they're not getting the same result. And all these effects that people thought were real, it looks like they were actually probably just due to random chance. And then if you think about how academia works, you have 100 professors, they all try and do the same study. The one that gets the result, say due to chance, they publish the paper, and then the other 99, they didn't get the result, so no one knows that they even did the experiment in the first place, right? And so you have this sort of survivor bias of if your result turns out, then you publish it, and if it doesn't turn out, then nobody knows that you ever did the test. And so anyway, there's a whole thing about how you can correct that, and people should publish the tests that fail, and any tests should be reproduced lots of times, and et cetera, et cetera. But anyways, so results are unlikely due to chance. Okay, and the more participants you have, like if there's actually a difference there, right, between A and B, if you have two participants, right, one that does A and one that does B, good luck like trying to prove that difference isn't anything other than chance, right? But if you have 1 million people that use A and 1 million people that use B, right, the difference due to chance is very unlikely, right? And so how many participants do you need in practice? It kind of depends too on how strong the result is. So if the difference there is very, very strong, then you don't need as many people to sort of show it. If it's a very subtle difference, then you're going to need more people to show that the difference is. So this is just my like reading of the literature as a sort of non-expert in this area. But when I look at user studies, especially in the field of usability, I see that if there's a strong difference, something like 20 participants is kind of like the lower bound on what people will do. So I very rarely would see a user study with any less than 20 participants. So this is sort of a minimum, and you can get statistical significance, but the difference that you're measuring needs to be pretty strong in order for it to shine through with only 20 participants. And then an upper bound would be, unless if you're doing some sort of like online study where you can, you don't have to meet the users, it's all fully online. If you're doing like a real in-person study where you're bringing people in labs, people don't do any more than 200 participants generally. Even 200 is a lot. It would be a lot of work to do a study that big. But if you had 200 participants, then you could probably prove statistical significance for like kind of subtle differences between the things that you're measuring. Okay, so that's just sort of back of the envelope, like in terms of what you should expect in terms of numbers of users. Okay, so that's a user study. Now the other two I'll go through a little quicker because they're just kind of variants on a user study. So a field study is kind of like a stronger version of a user study. And expert review is kind of like a weaker version of a user study. So in terms of how good these are, they're sort of ordered in this way. So user studies kind of like the sort of sweet spot in the middle. Expert review, fast, easy to do, but not that reliable. And then field study, very reliable, but also very hard to do. So in a field study, what you do is you actually deploy your solution to your actual users, right? So let's say you work at a company and you want all your employees to use a new service. You might pick half of them and give it to them. And then the other half just continue doing things the old way. And then what you'll do is you'll actually instrument your software usually to collect the data automatically in the background. But you might ask questionnaires and things like that after if you want to. So field study, you deploy solution to actual users. Often done as an A/B test. So half get A, half get B. And condition A here might be like nothing, like there might be no change. It could, so like you have some new solution, so you give it to half of them, and then in the other condition you just have, you have no change. Once again, just like a user study, it's a random assignment to A and B. You basically follow the same methodology, use the same kind of statistics and quantitative gathering, qualitative gathering. Sometimes you instrument the solution to automatically collect data. So one of the nicest studies that I saw in the security community actually was from some people at Montreal, University of Montreal, in Montreal, and some people in Ottawa. And they actually just gave users a laptop. So they I don't know how many participants they had. They had like on the lower end for sure, like let's call it 20. And so they just said, here's a laptop. It's free. As a participant of the study, it's yours, right? So that was an expensive investment. But then the laptop was instrumented to basically see how likely is it that they get malware just through the course of using it. So they weren't required to use it in any special way. It was just, here's a laptop, use it any way that you would normally use your laptop. So it's very close in terms of ecological validity. And then they also had like support and things like that. So if you have problems, you can come back. And of course they were measuring everything. And then they had some automated tools, and they had some privacy metrics as well, so that they couldn't tell every website you went to and things like that. They just got categories, or it was anonymized, or they didn't know. When you're looking at the data, you don't know which of the 20 users this data belongs to, different things like that. But yeah, so that's a nice idea of a field study. But as you can imagine, super expensive. You have to instrument the operating system, so that's a technical challenge to collect all the data, and then you have to pay for laptops for everyone and that type of thing. Companies will do this as well with their employees. Once again, if it turns out to be bad, then you're hurting productivity. Now, it's good that you found out in the context of a test as opposed to a real deployment, but still, you don't want to hurt productivity. You have to instrument your tests, and you have to make sure that the software is like almost perfect. Like there's not going to be any major problem rolling it out. And so anyway, field studies have a lot of overhead in terms of doing them. So in terms of pros and cons, so it's hard logistically to do one. It can be expensive to instrument. For data collection. And your candidate, like the thing that you're giving out anyways, it needs to be highly polished. It's not like, well, I have this like research idea, why don't I quickly write it up, and then I'm going to deploy it to half of Microsoft and see how they like it. Like you can't just do that, right? And if you're an academic, it's hard to do because you don't know the right person at Microsoft that can give it to half of the employees there and that type of thing. So that sort of goes into logistically hard, but it needs to be highly polished as well, so it's ready for use. So you don't want there's the threat of productivity decrease. And it could be that it's so instrumented that it's heavyweight and it's slow and it's buggy and things like that. And so, you hurt people's productivity, you're hurting the bottom line of the company, so it's actually costing them money. Okay, but the pros is that your ecological validity is strong.
Subtle differences.
Yeah, so this is the difference between somebody in a lab versus them in the real life. So you give someone a laptop, they get to take it home, you run your study over 4 months, right? After a month, they've even forgotten that they're even part of the study. They're just using their laptop like they normally would. Representativeness is usually strong because you're giving it directly to the people that you want to measure. Especially in a corporate environment where the security tools for your employees and the people that you're piloting or you're field testing on are your employees, then it's exactly the same. You can often do it once you go through the work of instrumenting the software. then you can do it to 1,000 people, to 5,000 people. You know, like there's no real cost to going from 100 to 1,000. So you can often do it with a large set of users. You can do it over a longer time frame. So the Coke Pepsi thing, you know, those are issues that you will discover in a field study because, you know, people are using it for 3-4 months. It's not that they just use it for 30 minutes and then give you their opinion on it. So like, yeah, so usually these would be like a couple months long, and you can measure fatigue, that kind of thing. Like users get tired of using it. And you can also look at like a broader set of tasks. So normally you bring a user in, you ask them to do a task. In a user study, you only have 30 minutes or 60 minutes with them. And so you can ask them to do 1 or 2 tasks and then you're done. You're out of time. But if you give them a computer, they take it home, they use it for a couple months, then you can see them do lots and lots of different tasks with it. So you can measure a lot more than you can in a user study because you have a longer time frame that they're using it. Okay, so this is the best in terms of most accurate, but it's the hardest in terms of cost and logistics of setting up. Okay, now we can go the other direction. So user study, field studies is a more accurate version, but sort of harder to do. Then we can also dial it back to what's something that you could do that would be kind of the cheapest option, even though it doesn't give you good results. But as long as it gives you some results, it's better than doing nothing at all. Okay, so what's kind of the minimum that you could do? And the other thing I'll mention later, I'll draw it out, but I'll just plant the seed in your mind, is that these aren't mutually exclusive, right? So you can do all 3 of them. In fact, that's what most people will do. So they'll start with expert review because it's the easiest. They'll take care of all the issues that they think are like the things that they can identify. So they get the software polished enough that expert review isn't really telling them much anything new. Then they'll go out and they'll do their user study, right? And then they might learn new things. And then they might do more than one user study even. And then when it's really polished, then they say, okay, now we're ready for a field test. Okay, so you can also walk through these sort of step by step.
Sometimes the user review is not that relevant, changes and all.
The user review?
Yeah.
Yeah.
But expert review matters in some sense, the user review doesn't matter.
So it depends. Yeah. So in my mind, it depends on the scenario, but like I'd say 95% of the scenarios, your user is the person that will actually use it. And by expert, I mean someone who knows the software itself or like what it's supposed to do and things like that. So as you move towards user review, your ecological validity, or sorry, not your representativeness increases, right? Yeah, but the number of people, like what one expert can tell you, if you want to get that same information from average users, you have to ask 200 of them, right? So that's sort of the trade-off that you get, if that makes sense. Okay, so experts in this case, let's define what they mean. They're an expert in what? And so we usually call them dual experts. So they have to know the methodology, the usability methodology. So I'll give you one methodology. They have to know what it is, how to follow it, how to use it, and you're going to learn one of them and you'll use it yourself. So the methodology we'll use and you'll do in the assignment is called a cognitive walkthrough. And then we usually want them to know about the solution itself. So if it's a security thing, they know how it's supposed to work, and then that helps them identify gaps. They might think, okay, a normal user is going to be confused about this. I know how it's supposed to work, so I can see that the way it's presented is different than the reality, and so this is why I think there's a point of confusion here. Okay, so I'll give you the pros and cons at a high level, and then I'll show you the methodology of a cognitive walkthrough. Okay, so the pro is it's cheap. You just need one person to do it. Sometimes you get 2 or 3, and then you see if they agree with each other, or you take some consensus amongst them. Because it's just an expert, and they're sitting down and they're doing it, they can usually do it faster than a normal user, and they can spend 5 hours, 8 hours doing a cognitive walkthrough, whereas a user, you have 30 minutes with them or whatever. So they can have a broader coverage of issues, so they don't have to look at just a narrow set of tasks. So relative to a user study, for sure, it's a broader coverage of issues. I'll call them tasks than a user study. And it's relatively fast too. You don't have to do ethics. You don't have to spend a lot of time like planning the study. You don't have to recruit people or anything like that. You decide one day that you want to do it, and then you just do it that day. Now the big con is that the expert is not a real user by definition. So there's going to be a bunch of things that they think are easy that real users are going to think are difficult. At least that's the problem. So it depends on how well they can put themselves in the shoes of a real user without actually being one. So the most common threat is that they miss problems that a real user might have. And the opposite is also true. Okay, so they might flag a bunch of issues that actually real users don't have a problem with. So they might be overly cautious or overly concerned. And then your developers spend a lot of time, they waste a lot of time fixing a bunch of issues that are really non-issues in the end. Okay, so this is like kind of not as important, but it's also possible that they flag too many issues. That are non-issues for real users. Okay, so one type of a expert review is called a cognitive walkthrough. It's probably the most common. Okay, so this is a type of expert review. It's a methodology, but yeah. So it's a recipe that you can follow if you want to do a cognitive walkthrough, and it will tell you what to do at every step. Okay, so the main concept is you start with your dual expert. And they're going to like pretend to be a real user, effectively. So they're going to use the software and say at all times, well, what would a real user think or do in this situation? Okay. Now, what are they going to do? What does that mean? They're going to use the software. Okay. So you're just going to open it up, and then what? What do you do in it? And so this is where a cognitive walkthrough has a specific way of doing it, as opposed to the other most common type of expert reviews called heuristic evaluation. So in heuristic evaluation, it focuses on the user interface. So you open the software up, you look at the user interface, you see that there's 20 buttons across a ribbon at the top, you see that there's 5 menus, and each menu has 10 items. And with heuristic evaluation, you'll just go through them one by one. What does this button do? Is they going to figure out like the way it's described or depicted? Are they going to know how it does? And if it pops up some other window, what do I think of that window, et cetera, et cetera? Okay, so you just sort of systematically walk through the user interface. Now the problem with it is it's very time consuming because user interfaces could be very complicated. There could be a lot of different options. And the way that you're evaluating usability is different than the way users use the software. Okay, users don't do that. They don't, even if they're learning software, they generally don't like try every button to see what it does, right? What users do is they open up a piece of software and they have some task in their mind that they want to accomplish. I need to write my final project for 6150. I'm going to try this new LaTeX thing because that's what, you know, all the academics use. Okay, I'm not going to read a manual about it. I'm not going to push every button. I just like I want to compile a PDF, right? So like what do I have to type? So that's my core task. I'm looking to the software to guide me. So like I might try like new document and then maybe it gives me a template and then I compile it and I look at it and see, oh yeah, like I see how it says title here and if I change that and then it changes over here. Whatever, you're sort of figuring it out as you use it, okay? So what a cognitive walkthrough does is it tries to model that. So what it says is, what the usability expert is going to do is they're going to write down tasks that the users will want to do with the software and they're going to try and do that task, okay? So they're just going to open the software up and say, in my mind, I want to do this task. How do I figure out, as a real user, how do I figure out how to even accomplish that task? Okay. So the first thing that you do is you define what those tasks are. So you define a set of tasks. And we call them core tasks because you try to focus on like the most important ones first. So at the end of your cognitive walkthrough, you're not really saying everything there is to say about the usability of the software. You're really just saying, how does it do, at least in terms of these core tasks? That's all you're trying to do. But of course, you can define more and more core tasks and as you want to look at it in more and more detail. Okay? And then, okay, so now I have my core task. So I'm going to open the software up and I'm going to start doing that core task. And the software is either going to be good or bad. Right? So how am I like rating it or scoring it, right? Why am I saying, oh, it's bad, or this is going pretty well, so it's good, or it's going bad, you know? And if it's going bad, like what's bad about it, right? So what I need like a scoring criteria. So as I go through my core tests, I have something that I can say it's doing good on this, but bad on this. So we call that like a set of guidelines, or heuristics is the more fancy term. And they basically, it's sort of like an evaluation framework. We phrase everything positively. And same with our guidelines or heuristic. We're going to phrase it positively. So we're going to write them down in terms of what we want. So in the best case, this is what we expect. So they describe what we expect from the software if it were actually usable. Or I'll say solution, just because it could be hardware or something else that's not software. So the idea here is that it's phrased positively. Okay, and I'll show you an example of this in a second. Then basically you perform the core tasks as if you're an average user, and at every step you refer to the guidelines and try and determine how it's doing. Okay, and I'll give you an example in a second. Okay, so that's the high level view of a cognitive walkthrough. Now, before I show you an example of it, like I'll show you actual guidelines and heuristics and things like that, I'll just say that I just want to note the idea that these are not mutually exclusive. So the three, and there's more than these three as well, but these are the three most common ones. So often you'll do an expert review because it's cheap and easy. You might do it a bunch of times, 10 times or whatever. Like each time you're tweaking the system. You wouldn't do it 10 times in a row on the same system because you'll just get the same result 10 times. But you'll do it, you'll fix it, you'll do it again, you'll fix it, and eventually you're pretty comfortable with it. Then you might do a user study. And then you might even iterate on the user study a couple times. And then if you're in the opportunity, a lot of people will just stop here. But if you have the chance to do a field study, then you might do that at the end.
It is not enough to do it alone.
To do just the field study?
No, just the expert.
It's better than nothing. So it's like the problem with not doing the other ones is just that you miss things. And eventually you'll figure that out anyways, because like even if you sell software and people have problems with it, like that feedback's going to come back to you eventually. So the idea of doing the studies first is just to try and front run those issues and fix them before you actually deploy. So it depends on the circumstance. It depends on your budget, how important the software is. Is it going to be used by 10 people or 10,000 people? You know, like all of these things would factor into that decision. So you could absolutely, like there's lots of software that no one does any user study for, right? Especially like open source software, someone just writes something and that's it, right? So at the very least, you hope that they do some sort of expert review, but it might not even follow a strict methodology. It might just be, it looks good to me kind of thing, or I asked my friends to use it and they didn't have a problem. Yeah. Okay. Okay, so cognitive walkthrough, I'm going to do an example next class, but I want to show you enough of it that you can start thinking about it because I'm going to ask you to do this in the assignment. So I'm going to do an example, and the example will be for, I picked security software, so it's called Tor. Tor is a tool for doing anonymous web browsing. So it hides your IP address. Now, I want to explain to you how Tor works, but I don't have enough time left in the class to do that. And I actually want to do it. Like I'm going to install Tor on this computer, and we're actually going to do the process on Tor, okay? So we'll save that till next class. So we'll do those two things. But what I want to show you, so you can start getting a feel for it, is I want to show you what the core tasks are and what the guidelines look like, so you can have a sense of what they look like. Because in your assignment, I'm going to give you another tool, not Tor, and I'm going to ask you to do a cognitive walkthrough. And so the hard part of the assignment will be, not the hard part, but anyways, part of it will be coming up with the core tasks. Okay? Part of it will be coming up with the guidelines. So at least at the end of this class, you can start coming up with those two. And then actually doing the walkthrough, that's like the main part of the assignment. And I'll cover that the next time we have class. Okay, so a cognitive walkthrough for Tor. Okay, so the question is, are the core tasks going to be specific for Tor? Like if I'm doing core tasks for Tor, is it going to be different than if I do core tasks for some other privacy tool, for an antivirus or something like that? And the answer is yes. Okay, so the core tasks are specific to the tool. The heuristics are more general. So core tasks are specific to what you are studying. So different software will have different set of core tasks. And the but the guidelines or heuristics are generally the same. So actually, I'm going to walk back what I just said because I got too excited. I said you'll have to come up with your own guidelines. Actually, that's not true. You can use the guidelines that I'm about to give you. In fact, you probably should just use them. If you really want to add one, you can add one. So if there's something that you think is missing, that's perfectly okay. But the guidelines and heuristics are generally the same. But they might be specific to security. So because we're doing usable security as opposed to like just usability in general, there might be some of the guidelines or heuristics that are more specific to security. But most of them are pretty general things that you would just expect from software in general. Okay, so the Tor example I picked on purpose because when I was in your shoes, I was taking a course, actually an entire course on usable security. And so I decided to do Tor user cognitive walkthrough of Tor as my course project. So that was my final project. And I did my master's a long time ago. I won't tell you how long. But Tor's changed a lot since then. So it's kind of fun because every year I get to check in and they actually improve. And I have this like side theory that sometimes they watch these lectures or somebody who's involved in the project watch them because the things that like I say like get fixed. But it could also be that other people are finding it. So it's not as fun as it used to be 4 or 5 years ago because the software is actually pretty smooth. But it's good for you to see an example of actually good software because it's actually a really complicated thing to try and communicate to users. And they actually do an exceptional job at doing it. But anyways, so what I'll do is I'll show you the core tasks that we came up with, and we can use the same ones and the same heuristics. Okay. So the core tasks were very simple. There were only 4 of them. Okay, so the first thing is you need to install it. And that doesn't sound like a big deal. And today it actually isn't a big deal. So this is one of the things that they improved. But back when I did it as a master's student, you actually didn't just install Tor. You had to install Tor, and then you had to install this other thing called Privoxy, and then you had to go in your browser and change your browser so it would point your traffic at Tor. And like it was a nightmare. And so almost like 80% of what we said in the original paper was just on this core task 1. Whereas now it's just like they just give you a full browser. That's how they do it. So they decided instead of having users trying to configure their browser, and DNS is like not going through the browser, so you have to like grab that a different way, and it was a mess. They said, hey, we're just going to give you a browser, and it's all pre-configured. And so that's a much better solution. So this has improved a lot. But that's the first core task. And so this actually, what I said is actually sort of goes to these 2. So the first one is actually pretty easy. It's just install it. So like the main question is, do I have everything I need? Because I would download Tor, and if I only had Tor, it wouldn't be all I needed. I needed to get Privoxy as well, right? And so that's sort of, can I figure out at least all the things that I need to install? And then can I get them all like playing together? Okay, so the Tor browser basically solves these 2. The installation process is just like installing any software. There's nothing too special, but it does give you some configuration options at the start, and we'll go through how usable we think those configuration options are. Okay, then you want to confirm that it worked. Okay, so you have it installed, and you're typing in, some search query. And this is supposed to be anonymous now. Are you sure? Right? How do you know? Right? Did you do it right? Maybe you misconfigured it and you think that it's being anonymized and it's not. And you're going to go to websites that you wouldn't go to if it wasn't anonymized, right? And so that would actually create a worse error You'd be worse off than if you didn't have Tor at all. So you need to confirm it. And then you should know its status as well. So now I'm on Tor. This is being anonymized. I open up another application. It's running at the same time. Is that anonymized too? Or is it just, like I'm listening to music, it's streaming. Is my music anonymized? Or is it just what's in my browser window? So that's kind of like the status of things. And then can I turn it off? And then do I know it's off? And do I know I have like just a direct connection now? Okay, so the core tasks are pretty simple. They're just standard things that a user would want to do. And so you'll walk through. Now the guidelines that you'll use are as follows.
The core task should be challenging always, like this, for example, you said you had problem for installing and configuring.
Yeah, that's a good question. So I kind of misled you maybe a bit. I just raised that because I was writing a paper about it, and so I wanted to find interesting problems, right? But actually your core task should not be, it's not where you expect the problems to be. So the core task should be actually the tasks that users will want to do with the software. Yeah. And if they're the most straightforward basic things, that's fine. If that's what users are using, that's what you should use. Yeah. And so I think you'll see that like you can't use it if you don't first install it and configure it, right? And then maybe most users aren't even actively thinking about it, but it's an important question I think to ask about whether you know whether it's on or not. And then
Because in point of view of the user, how they can measure it is anonymous or it's not.
exactly. So that's the question you're going to ask. And then when you do the evaluation, you're going to look at it and you're going to try and figure out whether you can figure it out or not. Yeah. Ideally without having to open up a packet sniffer or something like that, right?
I mean, it is not a concern of a regular user.
Perhaps. Yeah.
So why should we mention it?
So what I want to do is I want to avoid users making errors with it as well. So I know what you're saying. They're not necessarily conscious of the fact that they should be asking this question, but we include it anyways because it's an important task. So that's, I'm sort of hedging a bit, but let's say that core tasks are things, obviously anything that the user should do that all users will do, and other things that would be critical for the user to do, whether or not they realize they should do it or not. So both of those are acceptable core tasks. If it's some non-critical thing that most users would never do, then it's not the best core task. You can still measure it though, because you want to test the usability of everything, but it's not where you would start. So you would start with the tasks that users do most often or are the most important from a security perspective. Okay. Okay, and then we have the guidelines. So what I'll do is I'll actually install the software and then I'm going to go through each of them, but it'll be a little faster. Like I'm not going to do all 8, but once you get a feel for it, you'll have a sense of them. But you just sort of write down, you're like, oh, it's doing pretty good on G1 or it's not doing so good on G4. Okay, so, and some of them are like slight variants of each other. But basically G1 says that the user should be able to, first off, they should know what they have to do. Okay, so I download Tor, do I know I have to get Privoxy as well? Do I even know it, right? So that's the first thing. The second thing is, once I know it, can I figure out how to do it? Okay, so I know that I need to do something. Now can I figure out how I need to do it? Okay, so it might fail, it might be fine on G1, but it might fail on G2. How do I know that I've done it successfully? Okay, so a lot of times it's like, I think I did it, I think I configured it right, but I'm not exactly sure, okay? So how do I know I'm in a successful condition? I don't want to make mistakes, okay? So if your users are making errors, these are the main ones, so you want to prevent them. And then we usually distinguish the severity of the error. So G4 is like an error that's not so critical or an error that you can recover from, okay? So like, I kind of misconfigured it, but eventually I realize it, and then I go back and I fix it, okay? That's not ideal. It's not the most usable system, but at least the user was able to fix it, right? And then the most important one is probably G5, which is that they shouldn't make errors that they can't recover from, right? So like in the context of Tor, once I send traffic I think is anonymized, and it turns out it wasn't because Tor wasn't configured right, it's too late. I can't get that traffic back, right? That traffic's gone, okay? So that's a dangerous error. It's one that I can't correct. I can't revert to the state of the world where I didn't send that traffic. We pay a lot of attention to the interface in two regards. So one is we look at the words that are used. So we mentioned this before with SSL, like if it's a lot of jargon or technical terms, or you're asking user very technical questions and getting them to give you answers, then it's not good on G6. Okay, so it should use terminology that users are comfortable with. And then the interface itself, so how it's presented, if it's a graphical icon, if it's not using words, if it's using some other interface to try and get you to do things, then the user should be comfortable using it. Okay, so it should be laid out well and things like that. So heuristic evaluation, the alternative to cognitive walkthrough, it would focus a lot on G7. But with the cognitive walkthrough, we're trying to focus on things other than just G7. And then the last one is that you should always be aware of the status of the application. So is it on? So in Tor's case, is it on now? Is it being anonymized? Is it not being anonymized? And then the coverage as well. So is this being anonymized? This isn't. You know, like what's my status of anonymization at all times? Okay. So yeah, we'll do it next class. We'll just install it, and then we'll basically keep asking ourselves whether we think it's doing well on these eight guidelines. And in a report, what you'll do is you'll basically say whether you don't have to like do all 8 for every step. So you can just highlight. Usually if it's sort of like it's okay, you don't say anything. So you're usually just highlighting either where there's an issue, or sometimes too you want to do the exact opposite. You might want to praise it and say, you know what, it actually does a way better job of this than I thought, right? So I want to, I can see that they really spent a lot of time trying to get all the jargon out of it and come up with usable language, and so it does really well on G6 or whatever. So a report can be like what they do well, what they don't do well, and then if you don't say anything about a particular guideline, a particular step, it's sort of just assumed that they do all right. If you want to be more systematic, you could like say explicitly for each one. Okay, is this sort of clear without actually seeing the process? It's clear what we need to do? Okay.
Capture or record our interaction with the software or everything we are doing.
So you can do it if you want to go back when you want to write up your report. You could do it if you don't want to be taking notes. You could actually screen capture it with voice, and then you could just say, oh, I see that it's doing bad on G2, or I see, and then later you can turn it into notes. But if you take notes as you go through it, you don't have to record it. Yeah. Sometimes you might get a weird error condition, and you might record it because you might think the developers can't reproduce it. So that would be the other reason to do it. So sometimes something happens on your computer once, and then you go back to investigate it, but then you can't reproduce it. You can never get it to happen again. So that sometimes happens. But okay, so that's good. So a reminder, no class in person. Next week it will be virtual. You can find the YouTube videos on Moodle, and then I'll see you in 2 weeks, and I'll give you an example of this, and you'll have the assignment in hand by that time as well. So when you see it, start thinking about what the core task will be for your assignment, and then when we do the example, then you'll have a sense of how to do the assignment, how to actually do a cognitive walkthrough. All right, thanks.